The sun was high that afternoon, and the streets of a small town in Georgia were unusually quiet. A soft breeze brushed against the flags hanging from the old buildings, and the faint sound of country music played from a diner nearby. The kind of place where everyone knows each other, and strangers are noticed immediately. That was exactly why people turned their heads when a familiar face stepped out of a dark SUV and walked toward the small cafe at the corner. It was John Cena. Not the roaring crowd, not the flashing cameras, just him wearing a gray t-shirt, a baseball cap, and a friendly smile. He had come to town for a charity visit, hoping to meet some local kids and support a youth center that was struggling to stay open. He didn't have his team, no security, no fancy car following him. He wanted to be normal for once, just another man grabbing coffee in a quiet town. Inside the cafe, a few people recognized him, but they respected his space. A couple of teenagers whispered excitedly, trying to take secret photos. John didn't mind. He greeted the waitress with warmth, asked how her day was, and ordered black coffee with a slice of apple pie. He was polite, calm, and simple, just the kind of customer anyone would love to serve. After finishing his pie, John thanked the staff, left a generous tip, and walked back to his SUV parked near the curb. As he opened the door, flashing red and blue lights suddenly appeared in his rearview mirror. A police car pulled up right behind him. The sound of the siren was sharp, cutting through the quiet afternoon. A few people from the cafe looked out the window, curious. John paused, a little confused, then stepped out of his car to see what was going on. A tall police officer, wearing dark sunglasses and a strict expression, got out of the patrol car and walked toward him. "License and registration," the officer said sharply before John could even ask a question. John blinked, taken aback. "Sure, officer," he replied calmly. "May I ask what this is about?" The officer didn't answer. He looked John up and down, almost as if judging him before he even spoke. "You were sitting in your car too long," he finally said. "Look suspicious." John smiled politely, trying to keep things peaceful. "I was just finishing my coffee before heading to the community center," he explained. "Yeah?" the officer said, stepping closer. "People like you think you can do whatever you want, huh?" "Just because you're famous." John froze for a second. The tone in the officer's voice wasn't just strict. It was filled with bitterness, as if his problem wasn't about parking or traffic, but about something else entirely. Still, John kept his voice low and respectful. "I don't think that way at all, sir," he said. "I'm just here for a charity event." The officer narrowed his eyes. "Don't get smart with me." By now, a few people had come out of the cafe to see what was happening. One man quietly took out his phone and began recording. The tension in the air was growing heavier by the second. John could feel it, but he didn't want to make things worse. He took out his driver's license and handed it over. The officer snatched it from his hand without a thank you. "You know, people like you come into towns like this and think you're better than us," he said coldly. "We don't need your show here," John sighed softly. "I'm sorry if I gave you that impression, officer. I didn't mean any disrespect." But the apology didn't soften the man's tone. He stepped even closer, his face now inches away. "You trying to act calm, huh? Think you can talk your way out of this?" "I'm not trying to talk my way out of anything," John replied, keeping his eyes steady. "I'm just trying to understand." That's when the officer's patience snapped. In a sudden, shocking move, he raised his hand and slapped John across the face. The sound echoed in the air, sharp and humiliating. Gasps erupted from the bystanders. The man with the phone lowered it slightly, unsure if what he just witnessed was real. John stood still. His cheek turned red instantly, but his expression didn't change much. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He simply looked at the officer with quiet disbelief. For a moment, the whole street seemed to stop breathing. A mother pulled her child closer. The waitress from the cafe stood frozen at the door, her mouth slightly open. John's voice came out soft but clear. "You shouldn't have done that." The officer stared at him, his jaw tight. For a few seconds, even he seemed unsure of what he had just done. Then, realizing people were watching, he turned defensive. "Don't talk to me like that," he barked. "Get back in your car." John didn't move. "I'm not resisting," he said gently. "But I think you need to calm down." "Back in the car," the officer shouted again, but this time his voice was trembling, not from power, but from the sudden realization that things had gone too far. A man from across the street called out, "Hey, officer." "That's not right." Another voice joined. "You can't just hit him." A small crowd had gathered now, their phones raised high. The scene was no longer private. It was becoming a moment everyone would soon see. The officer looked around nervously, noticing the cameras. His face turned pale. He muttered something under his breath and walked back to his car. Without saying another word, he tossed John's license on the hood of the SUV and drove away quickly, the tires squealing as he turned the corner. The silence that followed was heavy. John slowly picked up his license, his expression unreadable. The waitress ran toward him, her voice shaky. "Are you okay?" she asked. "That was terrible." John nodded gently. "I'm fine," he said. "Please don't worry. Someone got it all on video," a man nearby said. "You should press charges," but John didn't answer right away. He took a deep breath, touched his cheek lightly, and looked down the empty road where the police car had disappeared. His voice was calm when he finally spoke. "Sometimes people act out of their own pain," he said quietly. "That doesn't make it right, but fighting back won't help either." The crowd looked at him, unsure what to say. There was a strange kind of calm in his voice. Not anger, not pride, just quiet strength. After a few moments, John thanked the people who showed concern and got back into his car. Inside, the world felt oddly still. He looked at himself in the rearview mirror, seeing the faint red mark on his cheek. It wasn't the pain that bothered him. It was the thought of what could have happened if he had reacted differently. If he had shouted, pushed back, or lost control, it could have turned into something far worse. He knew the cameras were still rolling outside. He knew the video would spread soon. But he didn't care about his reputation. What stayed in his mind was the look on that officer's face. Anger mixed with fear, maybe even confusion. He started the engine and drove slowly away from the cafe. People watched him leave, some still whispering, others shaking their heads in disbelief. A few minutes later, he stopped at a red light and noticed a young boy on the sidewalk staring at him through the car window. The boy recognized him, waved shyly, and smiled. John smiled back, though it was faint. He didn't want that boy to grow up thinking the world was only filled with hate. When he reached his hotel, John went straight to his room and sat down by the window. He took off his cap, rubbed his face, and sighed deeply. The town looked peaceful from up there. Small houses, old streets, and quiet skies. It was hard to believe that something so ugly had happened in such a calm place. A few hours later, his phone started buzzing. Texts, calls, notifications, and the video was already spreading online. People were shocked, angry, emotional. Headlines began popping up everywhere. Officer slaps John Cena during routine stop. Unprovoked police confrontation goes viral. His team called, asking what happened, what he wanted to say publicly. But John wasn't ready to speak. He wanted to think, to breathe. He stared out the window as the evening sun painted the sky orange and red. He thought about the officer's words, about the bitterness in his eyes, and wondered what kind of life leads someone to such anger. He didn't want revenge. He wanted understanding. For a long time, he sat there in silence, watching the sky darken. He could still hear the echo of that slap in his mind. But what stayed louder was the whisper of his own voice saying, "You shouldn't have done that." It wasn't said with hate, or it was said with hope that someday, somehow, the man who lost control would realize what he'd done and learn from it. As night fell over the quiet town, John made a quiet promise to himself. He wouldn't let this turn into just another viral fight between a celebrity and authority. He wanted it to mean something. He didn't know how yet, but deep down he felt this moment would lead to something far bigger than anyone could imagine. The night after the incident was long and restless. John sat near the window of his hotel room, watching the city lights fade into the distance. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing since the video went online. Messages poured in, some from friends checking if he was okay, others from reporters wanting a statement. But he didn't respond to any of them. He just wanted quiet. Outside, the streets were silent, almost pretending that nothing unusual had happened. But the world beyond that small town was already talking about it. The video, recorded by the man outside the cafe, had spread like wildfire. By midnight, it was everywhere. Social media, news channels, even late-night talk shows. In the video, people could clearly see what happened. The officer's harsh tone, the unprovoked slap, and John's calm reaction. There was no shouting, no pushing, no fight. Just that on. A shocking moment and the stunned silence afterward. It was short but powerful enough to make millions of people angry. By the next morning, John's name was trending everywhere. The internet was split into two sides. Some people were furious at the officer, calling for his suspension, demanding justice. Others tried to defend him, saying things like, "Maybe it was edited," or "We don't know the full story." Reporters began showing up outside the hotel, waiting for John to appear. The local police department released a short statement claiming that an incident had occurred, but refused to give details. They said the matter was under review. That only made people more suspicious. Inside the hotel, John stayed quiet. He wasn't angry, not the way everyone expected him to be. Instead, he looked thoughtful, as if trying to see the bigger picture behind all the noise. His assistant, who had flown in that morning, placed a stack of newspapers on the table. Every headline was about him. Police officer assaults John Cena. Outrage after viral video. John's calm reaction wins hearts. "You should say something," his assistant said carefully. "People are waiting to hear from you. If you stay silent, they'll start making their own stories." John nodded slowly. "I know, but I don't want to turn this into a fight. I want to think before I speak." He took one of the newspapers and looked at the photo on the front page, a still frame from the video showing him right after the slap. His face looked calm, but his eyes told a different story. They showed hurt, confusion, and disappointment. He stared at that picture for a long time before folding the paper and setting it aside. By afternoon, news vans were parked outside the police department. Journalists tried to question the officers going in and out, but no one gave answers. Inside, the chief of police called an emergency meeting. He knew the situation had already gotten out of control. The officer involved sat quietly in the corner, his face pale. He hadn't expected things to go this far. When he saw the video online that morning, his heart dropped. The entire country had seen his mistake, and now his career was hanging by a thread. The chief looked at him sternly. "You know this is bad," he said. "You embarrassed the department and you brought unnecessary attention to us. You're suspended until further notice." The officer didn't argue. He just nodded. Deep down, guilt was already eating him alive. He knew what he did was wrong, but his pride wouldn't let him admit it yet, not to anyone. Meanwhile, at the hotel, John finally decided to step outside. The cameras started flashing the moment he appeared. Microphones were shoved toward him, questions flying from every direction. "What do you plan to do? Will you press charges? Do you forgive him?" John raised his hands gently to calm the crowd. His voice was soft but steady. "I know many of you are angry about what happened. I appreciate your support, but I want to ask everyone, please don't turn this into more hate. The officer's actions were wrong, but anger won't fix anything. I'm not here to destroy someone's life. I just want understanding and accountability." Reporters went silent for a moment, surprised by his words. They expected outrage, maybe even a threat of legal action, but John spoke with patience and humility. He continued, "I believe people can change. Sometimes we act out of fear, frustration, or misunderstanding. That doesn't excuse what happened, but it shows why we need to talk about it." His short speech went viral within minutes. News anchors called it the calmest response to chaos. People online began to praise him even more, not just as a celebrity, but as a role model. The video of his press statement spread almost as fast as the slap video itself. Later that day, John met with his charity team at the local youth center. Despite the drama, he didn't cancel his visit. When he arrived, the kids ran up to him excitedly, their faces full of joy. For a while, he forgot about the noise outside. He played basketball with them, signed shirts, and listened to their stories. The kids didn't care about headlines. They just saw a kind man spending time with them. While John was at the center, a group of parents approached him quietly. One mother said, "Thank you for showing our kids what real strength looks like. Most people would have reacted with anger, but you didn't." John smiled softly. "It's not easy to stay calm, but if we all reacted to hate with hate, we'd never move forward." By evening, the town was buzzing again. Protesters gathered near the police station, holding signs calling for justice. The officer's name had leaked online, and people were furious. John watched the news from his hotel room, his expression heavy with concern. He didn't want this to turn into a witch hunt. He had seen enough chaos in the world to know that when people act out of rage, nobody wins. He called one of his friends, a retired judge, and asked for advice. Sometimes, his friend said, forgiveness teaches more than punishment ever can. But forgiveness doesn't mean ignoring what happened. It means guiding people to understand why it was wrong. Those words stayed with John. He began to think about how to turn this painful experience into something meaningful, something that could help others. He didn't want the story to end with a headline about a slap. He wanted it to end with change. That night, as he prepared to rest, he received a call from an unknown number. When he answered, there was silence at first. Then a low voice said, "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry, it was the officer." His tone was shaky, unsure. "I messed up," he said quietly. "I don't have any excuse. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't know what I was thinking." John didn't interrupt. He listened quietly. The officer continued, "I've been on the job for years. I've seen a lot, dealt with a lot. But that day, I let my frustration get the best of me. I saw you and assumed things. I was wrong." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then John said softly, "It takes courage to admit that. I appreciate your honesty." The officer sighed. "I'm suspended. Probably going to lose my job." "I guess I deserve it," John replied. "Maybe you do. But maybe this can be a chance to start again. Differently this time." There was a long pause, and then the officer said, "Thank you for not turning everyone against me." John's voice was calm. "People can change. I believe that. But it starts with accepting what we did and trying to do better." When the call ended, John sat quietly for a while. He didn't tell anyone about it, not his assistant, not the media. It was a private moment that didn't need to be shared. Over the next few days, the story continued to dominate headlines. The officer's suspension became official, and the department promised to review its training and community policies. John didn't demand it. They did it on their own, after realizing how badly things had gone. But the more people talked about it, the more they began to focus on John's response rather than the officer's mistake. Articles were written about patience, respect, and empathy. Teachers used the story to talk to their students about emotional control and kindness. It became something bigger than a scandal. It became a lesson. By the end of the week, John posted a single message on social media. It wasn't long or dramatic. It read, "Anger never heals anger. Only understanding can." The post received millions of likes and thousands of comments from people thanking him for being different, for reminding them that strength isn't about fighting back. It's about standing tall with dignity. In that small town, life slowly returned to normal. The cafe reopened like usual, though people still whispered about what happened that afternoon. The waitress who saw it all said later that she'd never forget the look on John's face, calm, composed but full of quiet pain. And somewhere on the edge of town, the officer sat alone thinking about that same moment. The image of John's steady eyes after the slap wouldn't leave his mind. It wasn't the look of anger, it was the look of disappointment. And for the first time, morning sunlight streamed through the curtains of John's hotel room. It was quiet except for the soft hum of traffic outside. The world was still talking about what had happened, but John had spent the last 2 nights in deep thought. He wasn't angry anymore and just thoughtful. He wanted to respond, but in a way that could do some good. He didn't want this story to end with blame. He wanted it to end with a message. When his assistant entered the room with breakfast, she found John sitting by the window with a notebook in his hand. He had been writing since dawn. "You're up early," she said softly. "I couldn't sleep," John replied. "I've been thinking about what to say." She hesitated before asking, "Are you sure you want to talk publicly again?" "The media's twisting everything. Some are calling you too soft. Others think you're hiding anger." John smiled faintly. "Maybe they're right. But the truth isn't about how loud we talk. It's about what we say when the world is listening." He put down his pen and looked out at the busy street below. "If I stay silent, people will only remember the slap. But if I speak, maybe they'll remember something bigger. Maybe they'll remember how we handled it." A few hours later, the hotel lobby was filled with reporters, cameras, and lights. John walked in wearing a simple white shirt and jeans. No flashy suit, no team beside him. He walked calmly to the podium that had been set up. The crowd fell silent. He looked at them for a moment before speaking. "I know many of you are waiting for me to talk about what happened. I know people are angry, and I understand why. But today, I'm not here to talk about anger. I'm here to talk about what we can learn from it." The cameras clicked nonstop. He continued, his voice gentle but steady. What happened that day shouldn't have happened. But I also believe that one bad moment doesn't define a person's entire life. It shows what pressure, misunderstanding, and frustration can do when we forget to breathe and think. He paused, letting his words settle in the quiet room. I've spent my life trying to teach strength. Not just the kind that builds muscles, but the kind that controls emotions. Real strength isn't about hitting back. It's about staying calm when you have every reason not to. The audience listened closely. Some reporters even put down their cameras. There was something raw and honest in his tone. He wasn't reading from a paper. He was speaking from the heart. I don't want revenge, he said. I want change. I want us to look at how we treat each other, especially when we're angry or afraid. I've asked the department here to start a program, one that helps officers learn better ways to handle situations and people. I'll help fund it myself. That last line surprised everyone. Murmurs spread through the crowd. He wasn't asking for an apology or a lawsuit. He was offering help. It was something few expected from a man who had been humiliated publicly. He went on, I believe people can grow. That officer made a mistake, but that mistake can teach hundreds of others what not to do. If this brings even a little more compassion into how we treat each other, then something good came out of it. When he finished, there was a long silence before the room erupted in quiet applause. Even some of the reporters who came expecting a scandal felt respect for his calmness. Later that day, clips from his speech were everywhere. People called it a masterclass in grace. Others said it was how real leadership looks. But while most praised him, not everyone agreed. Online, debates started again. Some people said he was being too forgiving. He should have pressed charges, one comment read. If he lets it go, others will think they can get away with it. Another said, this is why he's different. He teaches peace even when hurt. John didn't read the comments. He knew not everyone would understand. Forgiveness was often harder for people to accept than anger. But deep down, he knew he'd made the right choice. Meanwhile, the police department officially announced they were partnering with John's charity to organize a new training program for community relations. The idea spread quickly. Other cities began showing interest too. For once, something positive was growing from something painful. The officer who had slapped him watched all of this from home. He hadn't left his house in days. Every time he turned on the TV, he saw John's calm face and kind words, the same man he had wronged. The guilt grew heavier each time. One evening, he sat on his porch staring at the quiet street. His wife came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat beside him. You should talk to him again, she said gently. He gave you a chance to make things right. Don't waste it. He nodded, but words failed him. I don't even know what to say, he whispered. How do you apologize for something like that? By being honest, she said, and by changing who you are after it. The next day, he wrote a short letter. It wasn't long, just a few lines. He thanked John for his forgiveness and admitted he had let anger and bias cloud his judgment. He didn't ask for sympathy, only understanding. Then he mailed it to John's foundation, unsure if it would ever reach him. A week later, John received the letter. He read it carefully twice. The words were shaky, written with guilt but also sincerity. He smiled faintly, then folded it neatly and kept it inside his notebook, the same one he had written in before his press conference. It reminded him that change was possible even in unexpected places. That same week, John visited the youth center again. The kids greeted him with excitement, unaware of how much had changed since his last visit. They ran up to him with big smiles and asked, "Did the bad cop say sorry?" He chuckled softly and said, "He did. And you know what? Saying sorry is the first step to becoming better." The kids nodded like they understood, though their young minds couldn't yet grasp the full weight of his words. Still, it was a moment that showed how forgiveness could teach even the smallest heart something valuable. As the days went on, John's decision continued to inspire others. Schools began using the story in discussions about respect and emotional control. A few police departments reached out to his team, asking if he could help design workshops about kindness and communication. One afternoon, John sat down for an interview on national television. The host asked, "Most people in your position would have pressed charges or gone on a campaign for punishment. Why didn't you?" John smiled. "Because I've seen what punishment does. It creates fear. But understanding creates growth. I'm not interested in fear. I'm interested in change. The host nodded slowly. Do you believe the officer deserves forgiveness? Forgiveness isn't something you deserve, John said thoughtfully. It's something you offer because you believe in someone's ability to be better. I forgave him because I want him, and others watching, to realize that even when we fall, we can still stand up again differently. His answer went viral that night. People quoted it, shared it, wrote about it. The story that began with outrage had now turned into one of hope. In the small town where it all began, things also started to shift. The cafe that witnessed the whole event had a new kind of energy. Locals talked less about the slap and more about what came after. They admired how calmness had changed the narrative. The same officer, now suspended, began volunteering at a local shelter quietly away from cameras. He wasn't ordered to. He just wanted to do something that mattered. It was his small step toward redemption. A few weeks later, John received a photo in the mail. It showed a group of officers sitting in a classroom during the first empathy and communication workshop organized by his foundation. On the back, someone had written, "Because of you, we're learning to be better." John looked at the picture for a long time, feeling a quiet satisfaction. That night, he went for a walk alone through the quiet streets of the same town. The air was cool and the stars sparkled above. He passed by the cafe where everything had started. It looked peaceful now, almost unreal. He smiled, remembering that one simple choice in now, to stay calm instead of fighting back, had changed so much. When he reached the edge of town, he stopped and looked back. Sometimes, he thought, life gives us moments that test who we really are. We can let them break us or we can let them teach us. That day had taught him more about humanity than any championship or trophy ever could. As he walked back under the streetlights, a small voice from inside the cafe called out, "Hey, you're the guy who stayed calm." John turned, laughed softly, and waved. "I try my best," he said, then kept walking into the night. What had started as an act of hate had quietly turned into a lesson in hope, one that would ripple far beyond that little town. Years. He wanted to become someone better than that. The officer hadn't slept properly in days. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that moment replaying again and again. The crowd watching, John standing there quietly, and his own hand striking out in anger. The sound of that slap had become a haunting echo in his head. He used to be proud of his job, proud of wearing the badge, but now when he looked at himself in the mirror, he barely recognized the man staring back. News of the incident had spread everywhere. People in his neighborhood whispered when he walked by. His fellow officers avoided eye contact. Some told him to keep his head down until things calmed, others said nothing at all, but silence felt heavier than judgment. One evening, he sat alone on his porch staring at the sunset. The sky burned orange and gold, but it gave him no comfort. His wife had stopped talking much, his children didn't know what to say, and inside, guilt kept eating him alive. He turned on the television, and there it was again. John Cena's calm face at the press conference talking about forgiveness, patience, and understanding. John wasn't angry. He wasn't calling for revenge. He was talking about change. Real change. The officer leaned forward, listening closely. Every word hit him like a truth he'd been running from. John said, "Sometimes people hurt others not because they're evil, but because they've been carrying pain they never faced. But healing starts when we stop pretending we're fine." That line stuck with him. It was as if John was speaking directly to him. For the first time in years, the officer felt something break inside, the hard shell of pride that had covered up his fears and bitterness. He switched off the TV and just sat there in silence, realizing how far he had fallen from the man he once wanted to be. The next morning, he decided to do something he had never imagined doing. He wanted to meet John, not as a police officer, not as a man defending his actions, but as a person asking for forgiveness. But how could he? The media was everywhere. He didn't want this to be another headline. He wanted it to be real. He reached out quietly through a mutual contact, someone from the charity event John had attended that day. He wrote a short message that simply said, "I don't deserve your time, but I need to say something face to face." No cameras, no press, just the truth. He didn't expect a reply. But 2 days later, he got one. John agreed to meet him. The meeting place was a quiet park outside the city, early in the morning when no one else was around. The officer arrived first, feeling his heart pound so hard he could hear it. His hands were trembling as he waited. A light breeze rustled the leaves and birds chirped like they were unaware of the storm in his chest. Then, John walked up. Simple jeans, hoodie, baseball cap. No bodyguards, no cameras, just him. For a moment, the officer didn't know what to say. He had practiced so many lines, but now words failed him. He finally managed to speak, his voice shaking. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know that's not enough. I don't even expect you to forgive me. But I had to look you in the eye and tell you how wrong I was." John didn't interrupt. He just nodded slightly, letting the man speak. "I thought I was doing my job," the officer continued, his voice cracking. "But I was angry that day. Angry at everything, the system, my own life, people who I thought looked down on me. I took it out on you because you were calm, confident, and I wasn't. I see that now. I don't know what happened to me, I just lost control." For a few seconds, neither of them said anything. The sound of wind filled the silence. Then John took a small step closer. "You know," John said softly, "you could have ruined your own life that day. You almost did, but you showed up here, and that matters. Most people run away from their mistakes. You're facing yours." The officer looked down, tears finally escaping his eyes. "I don't deserve forgiveness." John sighed gently. "Maybe not. But forgiveness isn't about deserving it. It's about giving both people a chance to move forward." The officer looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time. John's expression wasn't one of anger. It was full of quiet strength. There was no hate, no revenge, only understanding. John continued, "You've spent your whole life trying to be respected, right? I get it. But respect doesn't come from authority. It comes from how we treat people, especially when we have the power to hurt them." The words hit deep. The officer felt like someone had just opened a locked door in his heart. He nodded slowly, unable to speak. They talked for almost an hour. About life, pressure, and how easy it is for good people to lose their way. John listened more than he spoke, and the officer found himself saying things he hadn't admitted even to himself. When they stood up to leave, John extended his hand. The officer hesitated, then shook it firmly. "Thank you," he whispered. John smiled faintly. "Don't thank me. Just do better. Not for the world, for yourself." As John walked away, the officer stayed there for a long time, watching him disappear down the path. The morning sun had fully risen now, lighting the park in warm colors. It felt like a new beginning. After that meeting, the officer made small changes. He volunteered for community events. He attended counseling sessions. He even spoke to younger officers about emotional control and empathy. It wasn't easy. People still judged him, some still mocked him, but he no longer tried to defend his past. Instead, he focused on changing his future. Months went by. He kept track of John's charity work, quietly admiring how he continued spreading messages of kindness and equality. Every time he saw John on TV talking about respect and compassion, he remembered their talk in the park and felt grateful. One day, his department invited him to join a new community project, one aimed at rebuilding trust between officers and civilians. At first he hesitated, afraid people would reject him. But then he remembered John's words, "Don't let this mistake define you. Let it change you." He accepted the offer. During the first workshop, he stood in front of a group of young recruits, his palms sweaty. For a moment he wanted to walk away, but then he took a deep breath and said, "I'm not proud of my past, but I'm proud that I'm not the same man anymore." He shared his story, honestly, without excuses. The room was silent, everyone listening carefully. Some of them looked shocked, others thoughtful, but one thing was clear. They respected him not for his rank, but for his honesty. After the session ended, one of the recruits walked up and said, "Sir, that took courage." "I'll remember what you said," the officer smiled. For the first time in a long time, it felt like he was making a difference again, not through authority, but through humility. That night, he sat in his car outside the station, staring at the city lights. He felt peace, and a kind he hadn't felt in years. He took out a small notepad and wrote a few words. "Change starts with facing yourself." He folded the paper and kept it in his wallet. As a reminder of the day everything began to turn around. From then on, every decision he made carried a bit more thought, a bit more heart. And though he couldn't erase the past, he was living proof that people could grow beyond their worst mistakes. Some months later, when John visited that same town again for another charity event, the officer was there. not in uniform but as a volunteer helping set up chairs and greet guests. When John saw him, he smiled warmly. No words were needed. Both men understood that forgiveness wasn't just about letting go. It was about moving forward with purpose. That day, the officer realized something powerful. The world didn't change when he wore a badge or enforced rules. It changed when he listened, understood, and treated others with dignity. And that, he knew, was the lesson he would carry for the rest of his life. A few months had passed since that quiet meeting in the park, but its impact continued to ripple far beyond what anyone could have imagined. The town that once made headlines for the wrong reason was slowly finding a new reputation, not because of scandal, but because of transformation. John had kept his promise of turning pain into purpose. He stayed in touch with the charity group that had first brought him there and started planning something bigger, a community event focused on kindness, unity, and healing. He wanted to bring people together, police officers, families, young kids, and local businesses, to remind everyone that good can still rise from mistakes. The officer, who had been rebuilding his life one day at a time, got a quiet phone call one morning. It was from one of the event organizers. They told him John was coming back and wanted him to attend, not as an officer under review, but as a member of the community. At first, he didn't know how to feel. The thought of standing in front of a crowd again made his stomach twist. He didn't want attention, but something inside told him that maybe this was part of the journey, facing people not to defend himself, but to show what learning and forgiveness could look like. When the day finally arrived, the town square looked different. Colorful banners hung from lampposts, food stalls lined the sidewalks, and people filled the area with laughter and music. It didn't feel like the same place where that awful moment had once happened. It felt alive again, hopeful. John arrived quietly without any grand entrance. He greeted people like old friends, shaking hands, hugging kids, smiling with that calm sincerity that made people trust him. He wasn't there as a celebrity. He was there as a person trying to make a difference. When the time came for the speeches, the mayor stood up first, thanking everyone for being part of a new chapter. Then John was invited to the stage. The crowd clapped, but he waved lightly for them to settle. He wasn't looking for applause. "Thank you for being here," John began, his voice gentle but firm. "A few months ago, something painful happened in this town, but instead of letting it divide us, we decided to learn from it. We decided to grow. That's why I'm here today." He paused, scanning the crowd. Everyone was listening. "We all make mistakes," he continued. "But the real test isn't what happens when we fall. It's what we do after. That's what defines who we are." Then, to everyone's surprise, he looked to the side of the stage and said, "There's someone here today who understands that better than most. I didn't tell him this would happen, but I hope he doesn't mind if I invite him up." The crowd murmured softly, curious. The officer, standing near the back, froze. For a moment, he wanted to disappear, but when John met his eyes with a small, encouraging nod, something inside told him it was time. With slow, steady steps, he walked up to the stage. The crowd went silent. Some people recognized him instantly, others didn't, but everyone felt the tension of the moment, the quiet courage it took just for him to be standing there. John stepped aside slightly, giving him space. The officer held the microphone, his hands trembling slightly. He took a deep breath before speaking. "I don't deserve this stage," he said softly, "but I'm here because I want to own what I did. I hurt someone who didn't deserve it. I let anger control me. And that day I lost more than my temper. I lost my sense of who I was supposed to be." The crowd stayed silent, eyes fixed on him. He continued, "I've spent months reflecting on that moment. I've learned that no badge, no title, no power means anything if you forget how to treat people with respect. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'm also thankful, because that mistake led me to learn something I should have known all along. That real strength doesn't come from force. It comes from humility, from owning your wrongs and choosing to be better." Some people began to clap quietly. Others wiped their eyes. The officer looked toward John and said, "You showed me grace when I didn't deserve it. I won't ever forget that, and I promise to spend the rest of my life proving that your kindness wasn't wasted." John placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "That's all anyone can ask. To try again, and to mean it."